Is 1 p.m. We are back in session, back on the record, and I believe, pardon? Is 1 p.m. We are back in session, back on. Pick up from back in session, back on the record. He just said it was okay. It's still 1 o'clock and we're back in session and back on the record. I believe we just finished with your witness and you have another witness to call, Mr. Uda.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will call Daryl Grant to the stand.
Good afternoon, commissioners, ladies, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, Mr. Grant.
Afternoon.
We have distributed, and you should have in front of you, 2 documents. One has been labeled as CBC 6 and the other has been labeled as CBC 7. Are those documents before you?
Yes, they are.
Could you please state your name for the record?
Darrell, D-E-R-R-E-L, Grant, G-R-A-N-T.
And by whom are you employed, Mr. Grant?
Caithness Services.
And what is your business address?
It is 565 Fifth Avenue, New York City.
And did you cause in this docket these 2 documents to be prepared?
I did.
And if I were to pose the same questions to you today that were posed to you in both your direct and pre-filed rebuttal testimony, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections or additions to make to your testimony?
Just one. Thank you. And it's my response to NWE-064B. TC01 has been replaced by TC03.
So you're relabeling an exhibit, is that correct?
That's correct.
Is that attached to your rebuttal testimony? Right. Yeah, so it's my understanding is that you need to make a change to a reference number to an exhibit prepared by Mr. Cafaro. Is that
That's
correct?
correct.
And you are simply relabeling the number of the exhibit because
That's
Mr.
correct.
Cafaro changed his. So where does that appear in your rebuttal testimony, that change?
It's the response to Northwest Ended 064B. That's it.
So you're saying it's not in your rebuttal testimony,
Correct.
it's in response to a question from a
Question.
question where you wanted to change the reference to the exhibit so there was no.
That's correct.
Okay, so I guess that means that actually your direct pre-filed rebuttal test or your pre-filed rebuttal testimony doesn't have any changes to it.
That is correct.
All right. So, Mr. Chairman, at this point, I would move admission of CBC 6 and 7.
No objection.
Without objection, CBC 6 and CBC 7 are admitted to the record.
I would tender Mr. Grant for cross-examination.
Ms. Hill.
Good afternoon, Mr. Grant. On the witness stand and in front of all the commissioners are two reports you referred to in your testimony, and I'll be asking you some questions, so they're there for your ease as we get there, but you have your rebuttal testimony in front of you, correct?
I do.
Could you turn to page 25 of your rebuttal testimony?
Of the rebuttal?
Yes. Sorry. On page 25, you recommend a capacity contribution of 53%, correct?
I did.
And does this 53% come from tables in your testimony on page 22 and 23?
Let me look at tables 22 and 23.
Let me break that down for you, make it easier. Does 30% come roughly from the table at the top of page 22?
That's correct.
And does 23% come from the table on page 23?
That's correct.
So for these two numbers, you used winter only information, correct?
That's correct.
Let's look at page 22. It says table 4 of the synapse report. Could you look at the synapse report I have in front of you? Is that the report where you got the table?
Yes,
And is this synapse report the comments associated with the comments from the Commission on Northwestern's 2019 Electricity Supply Resource Procurement Plan?
where are you referring to?
The front page of the
Yes,
synapse report.
yes.
Let's turn to page 10 of that report. And at the top of that report is table 4, correct?
That's correct.
And that's the same table you used in your report, in your testimony, right? You condensed it a little bit.
Yes, just for the wind portion.
Correct. So the source of that table that you used says the source is 538 megawatts of wind. Is that correct?
Yes,
So if you look for the year 2021, isn't it correct that this table is saying that 538 megawatts of wind serves 28.4% of Northwestern's load?
that's what the table says.
So this table does not provide a capacity contribution, does it?
Well, it says here that the contributions reflect the expected contribution of wind or solar resource to capacity needs.
And you're reading the first sentence under that table.
Correct.
And that sentence says, contributions to daily energy requirements do not reflect the expected contribution, correct?
Yes.
Let's look at page 33 of your rebuttal testimony. There's not 33 pages. 1 second. Yes, it's 23. I'm sorry.
23. Thank you.
The table on page 23 of your rebuttal testimony also comes from the Synapse report, correct?
Correct.
Could you turn to page 8 of the Synapse report? I'm sorry, not page 23, page 22 of the Synapse report. So is it correct that your table on page 23 of your rebuttal testimony is a combination of table 8 and table 9 on pages 22 and 23 of the Synapse report?
Table 8 and table
9 of the Synapse report on page 22 and 23.
correct.
And these locations that you give on these tables come from the Pacific Corps resource plan, correct?
Correct.
And none of these locations in your table on page 23 are in Montana, are they?
They're not.
Okay, that I'm finished with the Synapse report for now. Could you turn to page 25? Never mind, hold on 1 second. Your 53% recommendation for capacity contribution, do you apply that to 80 megawatts or just the 50 megawatts of wind?
Just the 50 megawatts.
Do you know off the top of your head what 53% of 50 megawatts is?
With my calculator, I can do that.
That's fine. Let's see. What is the date on the Synapse report? That it was issued?
February the 14th, 2020.
And what is the date on the E3 report?
July 14, 2020,
And on page 24, your testimony
which
of your rebuttal testimony,
page 24?
don't you state that Northwestern has not responded to the Synapse report?
Yes,
Isn't it true that the E3 report was part of Northwestern's supplement to his plan?
yes, but nowhere in the E3 report did I see some of the damning conclusions from the Synapse report addressed.
Is it true that the E3 report came out after the Synapse report?
Yes, but the issues were never addressed.
Let's turn to network upgrades. Let's talk about it's page 13, but let me see if it's your director rebuttal.
Are we finished with the?
Yes. Do you agree that there are 5 million in network upgrades associated with the Beaver?
Which document are you referring to?
You don't need to refer to it. Just do you agree that there's $5 million in network upgrades from the Beaver Creek Wind 1 through Beaver Creek 4 projects?
Chafin is responsible for approximately $5.1 million to interconnect the 4 projects into the Northwestern system.
Isn't it true that the commission ordered Beaver Creek Wind 1? Let me back up. Isn't it true that the commission ordered Beaver Creek Wind 2 and 3 to be responsible for the 5.1 million in network upgrades?
Repeat that?
Isn't it true that the commission ordered Beaver Creek Wind 2 and Beaver Creek Wind 3 to be responsible for the 5.1 million in network upgrades?
Yes.
You just said that Chafin is responsible. Is Chafin going to seek a refund of any costs that it pays?
I think the commission spoke. There's an order, and we will not seek reimbursement of those.
Mr. Grant, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're having a problem hearing you. If you
Sorry.
could bring that microphone closer and
I'm
kind of
sorry,
just speak
sir.
into that, we would appreciate it.
Can you hear me? Perfect.
When you say we will not seek reimbursement, who is we?
Beaver Creeks 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Will Chafin seek reimbursement?
No,
Do you recall answering a data request from the PSC that indicated that Chafin would seek reimbursement?
if you can show it to me, maybe, please.
That's okay. It's in the record. Is there any confusion for contracting terms of who will seek reimbursement for? From your view, is there any confusion in contract terms over the cost of the network upgrades?
As I said, the commission issued an order, and we will abide by that order. And when I say we, meaning Chafin and the Beaver Creek 1 through 4 projects.
Do you ask the commission in this project to not allow the large generator interconnection agreement, or LGIA, to be terminated?
Yes,
Isn't it true that the commission cannot make any changes to the LGIA unless Chafin and Northwestern agree to those changes?
I think what we are asking the commission to do is to instruct Northwestern to extend the suspension during the period that we're in litigation on the Beaver Creek 2 and 3 projects. That's what we're asking the commission to do.
But isn't the LGIA a contract between Northwestern and Chafin?
It is. However, I think the commission, and I'm not a lawyer, so please forgive me here. The commission has an obligation to ensure that QFs can sell their output. And I believe that the circumstances in this case, the commission has the jurisdiction to be able to say to Northwestern that they should, in the interest of ensuring that projects can meet that obligation, and Northwestern meet the obligation to purchase the output to extend the GIA suspension period.
Haven't you taken the position in the past that there can be no changes to the LGIA unless Northwestern and Chafin agree?
I'm taking the position. You'll have to show me that where that's.
Mr. Chairman, may I approach?
You may, Ms. Hill.
Mr. Grant, I've provided you with a copy of a letter. Could you provide what's the date on that letter?
August 18, 2021,
And who is the letter from?
from Daryl Grant
And who is the letter to?
to Northwestern, Ms. Miller.
Miss Autumn Muller or Miss Muller? Is Chafin Wind Energy LLC the letterhead of this letter?
Yes,
Did you sign the letter?
yes,
And doesn't this letter state that it's your position that any change to the LGIA must be mutually agreed upon by the parties?
yes.
Mr. Chairman, I move for the admission of this Chafin Wind letter into evidence as Northwestern Exhibit 1.
Are there any objections?
No objections.
That objection, how have we labeled that?
North NWE 1.
WE1 is admitted to the record. Thank you.
Mr. Grant, you've been employed by Caithness and its affiliates for about 20 years, correct?
About 16 years.
And you headed the development team for one of the largest wind facilities in the world.
Yes,
Is Caithness Energy LLC the 100% owner of Beaver Creek 1 and Beaver Creek 4?
yes.
Who are the members of Caithness Energy LLC?
That was,
Mr. Chairman, excuse me, Daryl. I'm going to object on the grounds of relevance.
Ms. Hill?
Mr. Chairman, this is relevant to what entity we're contracting with here. As we've established, the LGIA is with Chafin, and there's, in data requests, we've established there's a lot of LLCs underneath Caithness Beaver Creek and above Caithness Beaver Creek, and we're just trying to establish who's the contracting entity, and I think that's a fair question, especially in light that Mr. Grant has said that he's worked for Caithness for 16 years.
I might just,
Mr. Uda?
I don't have any problem with council asking him who the members are. I just don't want to get into a whole thing about who might personally be involved, because I don't think that's relevant. I think it's just the companies that are involved.
Ms. Hill?
I guess he'll just have to object on each question I ask, but I do want to know who is involved in what company. And it's relevant to who we're contracting with.
But I guess what I would say, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I understand why they're concerned about who they're contracting with, and I get that. But what difference does it make who the individuals are who own ownership percentages of that? The company itself acts on behalf as the member, not the individual members. And those companies are the ones who signed agreements, not the individuals. So I think this is going far afield.
Ms. Hill?
Mr. Chairman, the commission has routinely given a broad opening for relevance. The PPA is in the record. And as Mr. Uda argued this morning, all these projects, Beaver Creek 1, Beaver Creek 2, Beaver Creek 3, Beaver Creek 4, are all related. He even argued that when one established a LEO, they all established a LEO. So I'm just trying to find out who are these people?
Just one last go at this, okay? Mr. Chairman. She's mischaracterizing what I said this morning. I was saying these projects all have done the same things, not that they were financially related. I have no idea whether they are or whether they're not, but I don't understand what the purpose is. You might as well go and ask a corporation, like, who are all the people who work there? The corporation is the one who signs the agreements. The corporation is the one who's bound by the agreements, not the individuals. So I would just continue my objection, because I think this isn't going to get us very well, and it's going to take up a lot of time, and
I'm going to overrule the objection. We will entertain a standing objection as we go on with this line of questioning, Mr. Uda.
I just would like to note my standing objection because I do think this is far afield, but I understand the chair's ruling.
Mr. Grant, who are the members of Caithness Energy LLC?
Several individuals. Do you want their names?
I do.
Bishop family. Les Gelber.
I'm sorry, could you spell that?
Les Gelber. Errol Grant. Dave Casale. Ross Ain. Ross Ain, A-I-N.
Just AIN? We both have accents. Isn't it correct that an entity called Sorbrick LLC is a 50% owner of Beaver Creek Wind 2?
Yes.
And who are the members of Sorbrick LLC?
Darrell Grant.
And that's the only member?
Yes.
And are you the 100% owner of Sorbrick?
Yes.
And how is Sorbrick related to Caithness Energy LLC?
And I mentioned the individuals in Caithness LLC, Darrell Grant, that would be Sorbrick LLC.
So what is your percentage ownership in Caithness LLC?
%1.78%.
So what is you're 100% owner of Sorbrick LLC,
Correct.
correct?
Sorbrick.
Sabrique. And Sabrique is a 50% owner of Beaver Creek 2, but you have 1.78% ownership of Caithness Energy.
Correct.
An entity called GACM LLC is the other 50% owner of Beaver Creek 2, correct?
Correct.
And who are the members of JACM LLC?
John McNamara.
Is that it? Did you list John McNamara as an owner in Caithness Energy LLC?
I did not, but we should have him there. Yes. He should be in the Caithness LLC bucket as well.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Do you know the percentage of his ownership in Caithness Energy LLC?
It's the same as mine. That's Sorbrick.
1.78%. And then an entity called Dan Chris Energy LLC is a 50% owner of Beaver Creek 3. Is that correct?
Yes.
And who are the members of Dan Chris Energy LLC?
The two members there, one is David Casale, since you want the individual names, and the other is Ross Ain.
I want to know the members. You're saying individual names. Are those the members?
I can't remember the LLC names. I just know the individuals. But if you show me the I gave you a diagram. I can look at the diagram and I'll be able to tell you.
Are the members of these LLCs publicly available?
Yes, they're in the FERC filings,
And what FERC filings are those?
the 556s.
Doesn't that just list the high level of, like it lists JACM LLC?
I think so. I think so.
So there's LLCs that own Dancrease Energy LLC, correct?
Yes.
But you can't recall.
No, can you repeat the question, please?
Who are the members of Dancrease Energy LLC?
It's either Ross Ain or David Casale. I just don't off the top of my head.
An entity called Chanticleer LLC is an upstream owner of Beaver Creek 3, correct?
I would prefer if I have the diagram, the structure here. That's a lot of information for me to just.
Mr. Grant, in response to data request Northwestern 3, you gave a high-level diagram of the entities below, but you didn't describe the LLCs, didn't describe the members of the individual LLCs. did you?
Okay.
I don't believe it's in the data request, so I appreciate your cooperation. That's
But,
So can you recall the members of Chanticleer LLC?
I'm not the company secretary, so you want me to remember all
I
of these
appreciate
things.
your patience with me.
I said I'm not the company secretary, so to remember all of these things, it's.
I appreciate it. I'll move off of that. Thank you, Mr. Grant, for cooperating with me on that.
Thank you.
Were you here for Mr. Uda's opening statement?
Yes,
And he talked about recovering costs and expenses. Do you recall that?
yes.
What rate of return does Caithness need to make these projects viable?
Objection. I didn't say anything in my opening statement about a rate of return.
Hill,
Mr. Chairman, he talked about the ability of a QF to be economically viable. And he talked about comparing that to a utility whose ratepayers make the utility economically viable. So that door has been open. If you can't criticize the utility for having a rate of return if you're not going to tell me what your rate of return is.
Mr. Chairman, my statements are not evidence. There isn't any evidence in the record about this at all. She's attempting to do an evidentiary examination based on an opening statement of counsel, which is not admissible in and of itself. My objection stands.
I'm going to overrule and let it in with, again, the reminder that the commission has every ability to determine the relevance of the information coming in.
Are you familiar with utility rate regulation?
Not very much.
Are you familiar with the concept that the utility has an opportunity to earn a return up to a certain point?
Yes.
What return does Caithness or Beaver Creek Wind need to make the Beaver Creek Wind projects 1 and 4 viable?
When you say return on equity, return on the project, what exactly do you mean?
We could start with return on equity.
These projects are extremely risky. We have been in Montana now for 5 years. We have spent close to $14 million and we have gotten nowhere. Very risky. There is a significant risk premium on equity. And we, meaning any IPP, would be looking at returns in the high teens.
So is 19% a reasonable
High
return?
teens.
High teens. Like 18, 19?
High teens.
You said you developed the big wind project. I can't remember the name of it. One of the biggest wind projects in the world as part of your experience. Can you help me with the name of that wind project?
Shepherd's Flat.
Shepherd's Flat. What return does Shepherd's Flat earn?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to object. We're going pretty far afield. Now they're asking questions about the rate of return for other projects. And I think this is very much outside of the realm of what we're supposed to be doing in this proceeding.
Ms. Hill.
I'll withdraw the question. Mr. Grant, would you accept PPA terms similar to the PPA terms that Northwestern has with the Beartooth Battery?
I've never seen that PPA.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Mr. Brown.
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. We're going to move now to commissioner questions. I'm going to recognize President Brown.
Mr. Grant,
Yes, sir.
thank you for being here today. I'm going to have you pull close to you your rebuttal testimony, please. I believe this has been marked CBC 7.
Yes, sir.
Right. I'll have you turn to page 14 of your testimony, please.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Grant. I'll direct you to the bottom of that page, that question and answer. So based on your response to the question posed in your pre-filed rebuttal testimony, my question for you, Mr. Grant, is if the commission does not adopt a measure and pay method for capacity, how should the commission adjust the projects to reflect the point of interconnection capacity figure Northwestern recommended?
Repeat the question, please.
Sure. So I just want to clarify that it's your testimony today that the measure and pay moots the adjustment, correct?
Correct. However, the point I was also making is that it's an 80 megawatt project. And I also went one step further by stating that because a measure and pay, it's a moot issue. However, it's an 80 megawatt project and that they're getting 80 megawatts worth of output.
So I guess then my question is that how should we adjust the project to reflect the point of interconnection capacity?
Well, I've been in this business for 40 plus years, and the payments are based on the installed capacity of the project, not what's done at the point of interconnect. In fact, if you look earlier in my testimony, although we talk about megawatts power, what we're really selling is MVA. Highly technical, but if you looked at the early testimony, you saw there that at the point of interconnect, you're getting 320 at a certain power factor. So it depends on how the system is being run, but everything is based on what's the install capacity. Furthermore, the energy from the project will always be a measure and pay because you've got to meter it. So it becomes a moot issue from that perspective too.
Okay, Mr.
I
Grant.
hope I answered your question, sir.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Grant. I'll direct you to page 24 of your rebuttal, please.
Yes, sir.
So you mentioned, Mr. Grant, in your testimony that SPP plans to study hybrid contribution to ensure that the contribution assigned reflects the hybrid's capability, correct?
That's correct.
All right, I'll ask you a couple questions based on that.
Well, in fact, that statement was from Northwestern. He stated that, Mr. I'm just quoting what Northwestern said. And the point I was making there is, if it's being studied, it's not ready for prime time. Excuse the language, but please go along, sir.
No, I appreciate that response. Okay, so my questions based on that then are, if the commission uses CBC's requested measure and pay method, does CBC believe the method will automatically update as SPP works on incorporating hybrid contributions in its methodology?
But I'm not certain what SPP will be doing in the future. All I can say is that when we filed our petition and the months prior to that, this is what was being used by SPP. And all we're doing here is using what the SPP method says, 1, 2, commission precedent. And the commission in Beaver Creek 2 and 3 and some other projects, they have blessed this, and we're just following that course.
So if there is an update to the SPP method, should the commission be required to use that updated method or new method?
Well, one of the problems you run into there is that we go out to get these projects financed. And the lenders, they want to know what are the parameters around the various inputs, outputs, so that they know what the revenue stream is going to be like. If we had a clause that certain things can change over time, no one would want to lend you the money, or they would put so many caveats that it's like going for a mortgage and they say, well, if they put a landfill next to your house, we're going to have to change the interest rate. It just doesn't work. So I would suggest, sir, that in cases like this, it's what we agreed to at the time, and that's it.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Grant. Next question be, if the commission lacks authority over executed contracts, please explain how the commission could extend the LGIA suspension as you have requested.
I'm not a lawyer here, so I'm not even going to try to dabble in legalese. But what I will say is and I'll base this on my experience working with other jurisdictions. The LGIA that Northwestern has is silent on what happens in the case of litigation. I've worked with WAPA, BPA, it's not silent. It talks about how that thing is resolved. We had a similar issue with BPA on the Shepherd's Flat project. And what was done then was, because there's litigation in place, there was a stay. I don't think anyone, Northwestern, nor definitely not us, would want to go spend $5 million. And we have litigation. We build a substation for what? So I do believe, this is now from my days working with Florida Power and Light and dealing with the regulators in Florida, that the commission has certain ways of influencing the process. Because this delay, in the 3-year delay and the litigation back and forth, it's not because of us. It's repeated filings and all this sort of thing. Right now, we're before the courts. And I think the interpretation, the commission has some amount of leeway there to say to Northwestern, this doesn't seem equitable.
So let me follow up on a point you referenced during your answer here. So you referenced other litigation. Do you know how that resolved itself?
Yes. In the case of BPA, once the litigation was over, then we were given a certain amount of time to go and execute the agreement. That's all we're asking for here. We're saying we're ready to go. Once the litigation is done, give us 30 days or whatever. Boom.
All right, I'll direct you to pages 8 and 9 of your rebuttal testimony, please.
Page what, sir?
8 and 9.
8 and 9. Oh, we're going backwards. Yes.
In this portion of your rebuttal testimony, you discussed variability charges, correct?
Yes, sir.
So based on that, please clarify exactly what you mean by, quote, variability charges. And describe how these charges would be assessed.
The charge I'm referring to here is Schedule 11. And Schedule 11 is only allocated to wind projects. What happens is, if you're a purely wind project, you have no control over what the wind is going to be doing. Therefore, you have no control over the output from the project. And there is a charge for that because Northwestern says they've got to integrate or put units on the system to be able to integrate that variability into the system. So in other words, if the wind goes up, they will drop a unit down. If the wind goes on, that unit will come up. And the commission ruled on that. Now, what Northwestern is saying is, CBC, you've got to pay Schedule 11. So in other words, although we're not a wind on the Premier Hybrid project, we've got to pay Schedule 11. Now, a wind project that pays Schedule 11, all they do is to dump the power into the grid. Northwestern's job is to integrate that power into the grid. So there's no schedule, hour-ahead schedule that the wind project says, for the next hour, I'm going to be producing 10 megawatts or 20 megawatts. Because we have a battery, we can produce a firm output. Northwestern is saying to us, now you've got to pay Schedule 11. And on the other hand, if you don't give us a firm output, you've got to pay a penalty. And I'm saying that's double dipping. I am willing, because I've said, and I've said it in both CBC cases, that we can perform very similar to a thermal unit in terms of firm output. I will pay that penalty, but don't charge me Schedule 11 then. Or if you charge me Schedule 11, treat me like a wind project and I'll just dump it into the system. That is the point I was making here. They're charging us twice, double dipping.
Right, Mr. Grant. So on that page 8 and throughout your testimony, you use the word hybrid.
Yes.
So let me ask you some clarifications on that.
Yes, sir.
So in order to be a hybrid, would Northwestern Energy need to have control of the dispatch?
Ask the question again.
Sure. Well, let me back up. So what do you mean by a hybrid?
Okay, yes. A hybrid means two things coming together. So we have the wind project and we have the storage piece of the project, and both technologies, both power plants, are then integrated through control systems. So it becomes it's a hybrid project, wind plus storage, operating as if it's one project or a single project.
Okay, so based on that is what I'm driving at. To be a hybrid project, would Northwestern need to have control of the dispatch?
No.
Would the hybrid SPP method require Northwestern to have dispatch control?
No.
And are there other adjustments required to the SPP method for CBC to maintain control?
CBC to maintain control. Additional.
So my question is, are there other adjustments required to the SPP method?
Okay, yes. The SPP method measures the output without going into the calculus of it. It measures the output of the project and it looks at the peak month and it looks at the 3% of those peak hours and it does a manipulation there. So it's really looking back at what you did. However, for the first year, there's no data. So you've got to put some information in. And so to answer to be specific to your question with an answer, yes, we would need to put a value for year one to start it. Then when you get to year 2, you can look back and you keep doing that by looking back at all the years. So yes, you need a value for year 1. And the commission precedent has been that you'd use the ELCC method as a proxy for the first year. After that, you just let it rip.
Thank you, Mr. Grant. You just answered my follow-up question, so thank you for that. So final question for you, Mr. Grant.
Yes, sir.
Can you tell the commission why you think the negotiated terms in the PPAs for the Beaver Creek Wind Projects 2 and 3 apply to terms in PPAs for Beaver Creek 1 and 4? Can you give us a summation of that?
Well, yes, I can. Several. We have been negotiating the Beaver Creek 2 and 3 projects for 2.5 years. And we have come to agreement on several terms. And I think why reinvent the wheel? Just use the same terms. The other problem we run into is, and you mentioned one about Schedule 11 and paying for those charges. You can't each time. One of the things that we do as a company, you go to a region, Montana is great for renewable projects. You look at what the rules are, you look at what the precedent is, and you design a project around that. If when you have designed a project, you spend millions of dollars, suddenly someone says, you know, we don't like that anymore. What do I tell my board? I mean, we expect in life things to be predictable. Now, in other jurisdictions, when things are going to change, there is a workshop. So all the parties, stakeholders can get together, and then you put your input, and then you can make a decision whether I want to be there or not. So to be specific to your question, why? Because that's the precedent.
All right, thank you, Mr. Grant.
Thank you,
Mr.
sir.
Chairman, no more questions?
Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner Fielder, have you got questions for Mr. Grant?
I do not, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Fielder. Commissioner, excuse me, Commissioner O'Donnell. Commissioner Pinocci. Thank you all. Where are we at here? Ms. Hill, have you got recross?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a few. Mr. Grant, you were just speaking about your board. Does your board consider the 4 Beaver Creek Wind projects one big project?
They're all tied together. They're tied together.
And does your board expect consistent terms on all 4 projects for the PPAs?
We all expect consistent terms.
And if the CBC, sorry, Beaver Creek Wind 2 and 3 projects, those PPAs are informative of the PPA here, why don't we just have one big PPA for all 4 projects?
One big PPA for all 4 projects.
Wouldn't that solve a lot of problems?
Can you expand on that, please? What you're meaning? Is that an offer?
I need to talk to my client. Don't you think that would work out great to just have one PPA for all 4 projects?
You know, I never foreclose on anything, but I can't say yes in a vacuum.
And let me clarify and give you another opportunity to respond. When I say one big PPA, I mean literally one document for all 4 projects.
I think, and I've said this before, we had ample opportunity for you to put offers on the table. And it's very difficult for me to be sitting here and you just throw this out at me. I mean, 2 months ago, we said, how can we get all of this done?
That's fair enough. I understand you I can't give you answers any more than you can give me. So let's, but doesn't the large generator interconnection agreement, there's just one for all 4 projects, right?
Yes, and that's not unusual in the industry. For example, we had in California with Southern California Edison, 8 projects with just one LGIA.
Somewhere.
That's how the renewable business really approaching. I mean, and so that's not unusual.
And were those qualifying facilities?
Yes.
Let's switch over to ancillary services. Regarding Schedule 11, how do we know that CBC or Beaver Creek Wind will use the battery to produce a steady output if CBC has dispatch control?
As I've said over and over in these cases, the way you ensure things is by having penalties. And you're suggesting, if you say you're going to deliver a firm schedule under your regs, if you deviate more than a certain percentage, there are penalties. And that's how it's done.
So in that scenario, isn't it true that CBC, the actions of CBC would cause Northwestern to be subject to some penalties?
No. Penalties will be back to back. You get the penalties, but you're charging us for it. That's how it works.
Right.
In every jurisdiction. That's how you get the behavior.
Northwestern gets a penalty and charges it to you, right?
Well, right now, you have a thermal plant, and the thermal plant is supposed to put out 200 megawatts, and instead it puts out 190 for that hour. There's a penalty. That's how it works. That's how your tariff works right now.
Do you believe that Northwestern should pay penalties for CBC's actions?
I think we're talking past each other. And the reason why I'm saying that is how power systems operate is very simple. The fact that we're a hybrid project, forget CBC and hybrid. We're another power plant on your system. And if we don't meet the conditions, there are penalties. That's how it works.
CBC provides steady output if the battery's empty.
We would not allow the battery to go empty. What you do there, whatever you're scheduling, you make certain that you have enough juice in that battery to be able to firm the output.
And let me go back a question. You said you were talking about that's how the system works, just like any other generator on the system. Do you call that?
Yes.
So CBC is willing to comply with the FERC tariff, just like any other generator on the system, correct?
All generators have to.
No further questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Hill. Mr. Brown,
Questions? Thank you.
redirect Mr. Uda.
Mr. Grant, do you recall Ms. Hill asking you questions about the Synapse report and how you used it in your testimony?
Yes.
Why did you choose to use those values in the Synapse report for calculating capacity?
In my experience working all over the US, and I'm familiar with the ELCC method, Northwestern has the lowest capacity contribution. The problem is the synopsis report was a coherent and crisp review of Northwestern practices in terms of how it models projects and in terms of the value it gives to projects. And I wanted to be able to demonstrate that, granted, synopsis report didn't look at a lot of the examples they gave out in Montana. But you look across the WECC, even areas that had capacity factors much less than Northwestern Service Area had multiples of capacity contribution. And as I said before, and I stand by it, it was a damning report. And Northwestern should address those issues. So this is why I use the synopsis report.
Is it your judgment that Northwestern has been engaged in underestimating capacity contributions of renewables?
Most certainly.
Okay, and do you know why they were doing that?
Objection. What is this redirect on?
This redirect is on the question about why Mr. Grant included these values in his table and the point he was trying to get at, which was the question that Ms. Hill was asking him about.
I don't recall asking him why I put them in there. I just referenced the table.
Oh, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Uda.
What Ms. Hill was trying to get at is that Mr. Grant mischaracterized the capacity contribution by using this table that he got. And Mr. Grant's testimony was that he used this as a surrogate. I believe that's what he said. In any event, I think I'm allowed to explore the scope of his response to explain why he did what he did, rather than leaving what I perceive to be as Northwestern's mischaracterization of Mr. Grant's testimony.
Ms. Hill.
Northwestern cannot mischaracterize Mr. Grant's testimony today. Northwestern has not testified. All I did was cross-examine him. I didn't mischaracterize it. He answered the questions.
And I am going to overrule Mr. Uda and let you proceed, Ms. Hill.
I promise I am coming to an end on this particular line of questioning. Mr. Grant, do you know why Northwestern would systematically underrepresent capacity of renewables?
I have to be frank. It's to lower the avoided costs. That's it.
And Mr. Grant, Ms. Hill pointed you to a sentence that appears below the table 4 on page 10 of the Synapse report. Would you turn to that, please?
What page is that on again?
Page 10, table 4 at the top.
Yes, sir.
And she had you read the portion of the sentence: contributions to daily energy requirements do not reflect the expected contribution of the wind or solar resource to capacity needs during the peak hours, correct?
That's correct.
Could you please read the rest of the sentence?
But they do highlight the critical importance of the resource to meeting energy requirements over the course of a peak winter or summer day.
So I want you to turn to the Synapse report again, because Ms. Hill asked you about it. You have these tables on pages 22 and 23 in the Synapse report that show all these different facilities. And I wanted to ask you about that because I think Ms. Hill's point was, well, none of these facilities are in Montana, right?
Yes, that's what she said.
And I think you would agree with me that all these locations are unique, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Is there any reason to think that Montana is so vastly different that, as you've testified, capacity contribution should be a fourth of what wind projects are getting in these various states?
Should not. And that's exactly what I said to the president, that these capacity factors in Montana are so high, the capacity contributions would even be higher than these, I would think.
And so your point, I gather from your testimony, is that there seems to be something systemic going on here. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
So Ms. Hill asked you what rate of return that you expected. And I think she limited her question just to the equity portion. I wanted to ask you, why would the risk premium be so high for a wind project located in Montana?
Regulatory risk is a big one.
Is that regulatory risk at all related to the systemic underrepresentation of capacity contribution for renewables in Montana?
Yes.
President Brown asked you a question about measure and pay, and if I understood your answer correctly, is you had to start somewhere in order to use the SPP methodology. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
And you used ELCC as the starting point, correct?
That's correct.
And why did you do that?
That was commission precedent. Northwestern was the one who suggested that approach in the Beaver Creek 2 and 3 case. And we're just simply using what they'd suggested.
President Brown asked you a question about why you wouldn't want to change the capacity contribution based on a new SPP methodology. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And if I recall your answer correctly, was it because you couldn't get investors to invest in the project if they knew the rate was going to change?
That's correct. And that's a material, it could be a material number. We don't know. That's correct.
And is that part of the risk premium that goes into the analysis that equity investors make when they decide to invest in a project?
Most certainly.
Ms. Hill asked you on recross, why wouldn't you just accept one PPA for all 4 projects? Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Why do you have 4 projects?
A lot of it has to do with regulatory and FERC and the ownership of projects, and also well, it all boils back to QF rules. Yes.
Do you recall the first Caithness proceeding before?
Yes. Yes,
Did you propose all 4 projects at once?
I did.
And did the commission accept that?
It was approved. No, it was approved, yes, but we couldn't go forward with what was approved.
Did you then reconfigure not the projects, but did you refile with just the 2 projects, CBC 2 and 3?
Yes.
And why were you doing that?
I listened to in fact, I remember I made a little speech and I listened to the commissioners very carefully. And part of the concern was such a large renewable project on their system. So what we said, okay, we will do a smaller project. We would also make the batteries larger so that we could address some of the intra-hour variability issues that was laid out, although we didn't, meaning Caithness, as designers of the project, we didn't agree, but we said, okay, we're going to be here for 30 years or 20 years. Let us reconfigure the project. So that was the reason why we went back down.
I want to talk to you a little bit about ancillary service because on recross, Ms. Hill asked you about whether or not the utility would be penalized if you didn't meet your schedules. Do you recall that testimony?
Yes.
Is it the case, and explain to me if I'm wrong, that Northwestern may receive the penalty, but ultimately you would be responsible for paying it?
Correct.
And do you have any experience with the delay between the time the utility gets penalized and the time that the project is responsible for paying that penalty?
Every other jurisdiction I've worked in, within 30 days, that invoice is on your desk.
So if you systematically fail to meet those schedules, how long will you be in business?
Out of business.
So if that's being the case, you have every incentive to conform to the schedules, correct?
That's correct. And that was the point I was trying to make with council.
And you're not a wind project, correct? You're not going up and down like this all the time, correct?
Correct.
Objection leading.
I'll rephrase. Mr. Grant, does your project go up and down like a wind project?
It does not. That's one of the great features of a hybrid project. In fact, in some jurisdictions, you've got to put storage with your renewable project to integrate them into the system.
And if I am understanding your testimony correctly, you're willing to pay Schedule 11.
I'm willing to pay Schedule 11. However, I'm not willing to do both.
If you were to pay Schedule 11 and not the penalty for failing to meet your schedule, would you have more of an incentive or less than an incentive to deliver any excess generation you had at any given hour into the system?
I have every incentive just to dump it on them.
Mr. Chairman, I think that's all the questions I have.
Thank you, Mr. Uda. Mr. Grant, you are temporarily excused. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Uda, you have, well, we're in between witnesses. I guess that's as good as any. Certainly, not, 11 minutes. We'll be back at 2:30. And it is 1:30 and we are back in session, back on the record. And Mr. Uda, I believe you have another witness to call.
I had to check the clock. Did you say 1:30?
I probably did. I don't know. Is this the PSC in the Bollinger Room or where am I?
I thought I was wrong. I was checking the clock. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, I would call Tom Cafaro to the stand. I think on the West Coast.
You may, and your witness was here this morning when we swore in.
I believe he was, yes.
No, that's all right. That undoes it. It's like a double negative. You can't.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cafaro.
It is now.
And you may have noticed when Mr. Grant was testifying, but you'll either have to speak up or have the microphone pretty close to you for her to be able to pick up what you're saying.
Noted.
Could you please state and spell your name for the record?
Sure. Thomas Cafaro, Thomas, Cafaro, Cuffaro.
By whom are you employed, Mr. Cafaro?
Chiefness Services,
What is your business address?
960 Homedale Road, Homedale, New Jersey.
And I have had placed in front of you two documents. Do you recognize these documents?
Yes.
Could you identify them for the record?
CBC 08 and CBC 09.
And CBC 08, would that be your pre-filed direct testimony?
Correct.
And CBC 09, would that be your revised pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Correct.
So, Mr. Cafaro, without getting into the revisions to your rebuttal testimony, have you familiarized yourself with this document?
Yes.
And if I were to pose the same questions to you today that appear in these two documents, would your answers be the same?
Well, CBC 08 would, just to clarify, right, this is the revised testimony, so
Yes.
hold on a second. So yes, what I'm seeing here right now, everything stays the same.
So did you cause to be submitted to the commission a revised rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
Why did you do that?
We had to submit a revised rebuttal testimony because Northwestern supplied new information that we've been trying to get throughout this process. And they submitted on April 15th, we were trying to get to the conclusion of how to appropriately inflate the network upgrades, which is part of the capital cost recovery for the proxy unit. So in the April 15th corrected filing, Northwestern let us know that 2018 inflation should be applied to network upgrades, which then has a ripple effect through everything that I've previously calculated concerning avoided capacity costs.
Okay, do you have the red line version of your testimony?
Yes,
Could you explain each of the changes that you made to the commission?
sure.
May I interrupt, Mr. Chairman, if we're just introducing the corrected testimony, I don't know if this is necessary to go through the red line. We have no objections to the corrections going.
Okay, I was just wanting to make sure that everybody understood the changes that were made. If everybody's okay with just moving his testimony into the record, I'm okay with that too, but I just wanted to make sure we were laying a foundation for the changes.
Commissioners? Mr. Brown?
If they're-
Okay, let's just then proceed, Mr.
All right. Oh, so, okay then, Mr. Cafaro. I would like to move the admission of CBC 8, which is his pre-filed direct testimony, and CBC 9, revised pre-filed rebuttal testimony, into the record.
Are there objections to either?
No objection.
Without objection, CBC 8 and 9 are admitted to the record.
At this time, I would like to tender Mr. Cafaro for cross-examination.
Thank you, Mr. Uda. Ms. Hill?
Good afternoon, Mr. Cafaro. You speak about a Mortenson index in your testimony. What is Mortenson?
Martinson, I do describe it in testimony, maybe in a little bit more detail, but they're a very large kind of construction firm in the United States who's, I believe, if I recall properly, been in the industry for over 25 years. Serves many different industries, but I also know them from the power industry and building power plants.
So CBC's worked with them in building power plants?
Well, we haven't built the power plants yet, right? So, but we may have gotten a quote from them to help, right, to support the construction of the facility, but we haven't, right? Obviously, we didn't construct the facility, so we haven't per se worked with them, but we might have advised for a quote from them.
Do you have a business relationship with them?
No,
You haven't conducted any analysis to show that the Mortenson index is more reasonable than the PPI index, have you?
no, I didn't conduct a separate analysis on that.
And did you conduct a separate analysis with comparing Mortenson to an index called the IHS Market Power Plant and Pipeline Index?
I am not familiar with the IHS market index, so no.
What proportion of the Mortenson Construction Index is based on power plant construction costs?
I don't have that specific information.
Do you have the proportion of the index that is based on commercial buildings?
I do not.
Do you have the proportion of the index that is based on water infrastructure?
I do not.
That's all the questions I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Mr. Brown?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner O'Donnell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question, and I don't understand a whole lot about economics is in very great detail, but in your pre-filed direct testimony under page 3, the very last line for 2021 inflation is 21.13 using PPI series published. How did you come up with that? How did they come up with that figure?
So that's published by the government from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's the producer price index. So it just takes a basket of overall commodities. And obviously they benchmark it year to year to calculate the inflation.
Yeah, and thank you for saying that, but I've never come across a figure that high for 2021.
Well,
It just struck me as being very, very odd.
I can definitely tell you that I did not make this number up. It is pulled directly from the website. And, you know, So this is different than CPI, right?
Right.
Yeah, this is not this is not a consumer price index, right? Which is, yes, the consumer price index is not that high, still high compared to, the CPI is high compared to previous, what we've been accustomed to, right? Over the last several years or even more than that. But the producer price index, yes, unfortunately, this is 21%. That's what it showed.
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Commissioner Pinochi, questions? Commissioner Fielder, any questions?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
President Brown, any questions?
No questions for this witness, Mr. Chairman.
So I guess we have no well, we don't have recross since there was,
That's correct. I don't have any questions.
No questions. Mr. Uda, can you move the microphone towards you?
Is that better? Ms. Hill asked you questions about Mortensen, which I think you described as a very large construction firm.
Correct.
Correct. Did you do any benchmarking as to the reasonableness of using Mortensen or this particular indicator?
Well, initially in the direct file testimony, we used PPI, right, as the proxy. And that's not necessarily, even though some of the underlying components make up the construction of a facility. I thought maybe, well, then let's get a more specific index to someone who's actually in the industry and doing this kind of work. So the PPI was 21% and change, and the Mortensen Construction Index was 21% and change. So, and maybe I misspoke and thought too quickly, but we did have some internal quotes where we were seeing increases in price, probably even in excess of 20%. So just looking at that, I concluded it was a reasonable index to use.
Have you had a chance to reconsider that, or do you still think it's reasonable?
No, I think it's very reasonable. I think inflation continues to be a persistent problem. So I do think it's very reasonable. And even Elon Musk, Tesla, trying to he does a lot to keep costs down for that company. And people look at him as the kind of the holy grail about keeping costs down for batteries. And I think a couple of weeks ago in his earnings press release, he even admitted supply of materials is likely to be 20 to 30% higher in the coming year. So.
All right, thank you. No more questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Uda. Mr. Cafaro, you are temporarily excused. Thank you. Mr. Uda, does this complete your case in chief?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. We rest our case in chief.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Hill, I believe you reserved time for your opening statement till now.
I did, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Northwestern presents a case with a reasonable approach for you today. You've heard the witnesses talk about precedent, and that's what Northwestern's testimony and exhibits are consistent with precedent and consistent with a reasonable approach. And it all ties back to the 2019 plan. That plan was public. That plan had a price forecast. That plan had an ELCC study. That plan had a marginal cost to serve load to calculate avoided cost. It provided estimates of avoided cost in compliance with PURPA that says utilities, when you file a plan or every few years, you need to provide your avoided cost data. We did that. And all of our testimony today is consistent with what we've provided. We're not changing terms. we're not treating CBC differently than we would treat someone else. And that sums up our testimony today. A reasonable approach, consistent with the plan, consistent with what other utilities are doing. Thank you. And when you're ready, I'll call my first witness.
Please proceed, Ms. Hill.
First witness is Mr. Joe Steinmetz.
Mr. Steinmetz was sworn this morning. correct?
Yes.
Mr. Steinmetz, could you please state your name for the record?
Yes, my name is Joe Steinmetz, Stimatz,
By whom are you employed?
Northwestern Energy.
And what's your title with Northwestern?
I'm the manager of asset optimization.
And you have before you a document. Could you describe that document?
Yes, it's marked as NWE2 and it's my pre-filed intervenor testimony in this docket.
Do you have any corrections or changes to that testimony?
No, I don't.
And if I asked you the same questions today, would your testimony be the same?
Yes, it would.
Mr. Chairman, I move that Mr. Steinmetz's testimony marked as Exhibit NWE2 be admitted into evidence.
Any objection?
Objection.
NWE2 is entered into the record without objection.
I tender this witness for cross.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Mr. Uda.
Afternoon, Mr. Steinmetz.
Good afternoon.
Nice to see you again.
Likewise.
So I did have a question about the Montana mid-C adjustment. Your counsel seemed to be concerned about that table that appeared in Mr. Schiffman's testimony about the fact that Montana prices, at least in that exhibit, appeared to be higher than mid-C. Do you know anything about that?
Yes, I reviewed the data provided in response to the data request to see how the figures in that table were calculated.
And just standing alone, that appears to be the average of those, of that price point, correct?
Specifically, the column related to EIM prices?
Yeah.
Yes, that appears to be the average of the prices that Mr. Schiffman gathered for that analysis. They aren't prices for generator buses on Northwestern's system, however.
Mr. Chairman, may I put Mr. Schiffman's testimony in front of the witness?
Oh, that's fine. Yeah, I was just about done. Familiar with that?
Yes, you're referring to table 9, correct?
Right.
Yes.
So do you recall the source of that data?
The source of the data in Mr. Schiffman's testimony.
Correct.
I believe he said he got it from a third-party data provider.
And you mentioned, I think, that these aren't, what you call it, busbar prices?
That's right. The prices he used were not for either Northwestern's load location or Northwestern's generator locations.
Are these the EIM points that you could get if you look for prices on EIM?
No, well, they would be some of them, but they would not be the generator locations in Montana. If you were to go to the EIM Oasis site, you would be able to find the data for the generators in Montana, and they would be significantly lower prices than the ones in this table.
What are do you know what the prices in the table 9 that Mr. Shipman are based on?
I do. He provided that information. They were locations that were the interconnections between Northwestern and some neighboring systems, including our interconnections from a market point of view with Pacific Corp, Portland General Electric, and Puget Sound at Colstrip, but not the pricing points for Northwestern system at Colstrip.
So when you try to figure out what this Montana to mid-C adjustment is,
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, but could Mr. Uda please speak into the microphone?
Thank you for that heads
somebody
up, Commissioner
following me
Fielder.
around with this darn thing. Gadgets. Anyway, when you do the Montana to mid-C adjustment, do you do any kind of reality check with actual prices in Montana? Or are you just making an assumption that because the power is remote from Montana at mid-C, that there needs to be an adjustment?
Mr. Uda, in this case, we have the price at mid-C and we have the price at generator buses in Montana. I can observe from that data, which I did after I looked at this table, and found that the EIM prices that are actually for nodes at our generator buses had a basis differential to mid-C very similar to what we use in our assumptions. I think it was around $7.50 for our load point, and a little more negative than that for our generator points.
So your testimony is that the difference between the bus bar and the other points on the EIM that Mr. Schiffman collected is $7.50. Is that correct?
No, what I was testifying about was the difference between mid-C and the EIM locations
Okay.
for our generators and load.
What's the difference between the bus bar price and those mid-C prices that Mr. Schiffman located? Or the EIM? I mean, excuse me, not mid-C, EIM prices.
Would you mind repeating that?
Yeah, I should probably do that. So he has EIM prices. You're saying those are the wrong spots. There's some other spots. Those are the bus bars. What's the difference between the bus bar price and those EIM prices?
I think the EIM bus bar prices and the prices presented as EIM Montana prices in Mr. Schiffman's testimony, if I recall correctly, was about $10 to $12. The correct prices are about $10 to $12 lower.
So how would one make the determination as to what the correct price was?
So I think what you have to do is pick an actual generator on Northwestern system in Montana, since that is what the generation from that resource would actually be paid by the market.
Okay. But why wouldn't you just use a point somewhere midway between one of these bus bars and mid-C? Because you would see price changes along the way, and that might be more representative, right?
No, I think what we're trying to do in this case is value the energy at the point it's produced at the generator bus bar. That's where Northwestern takes ownership from a QF. We take delivery at the point where it's generated. So looking at what actually exists in the world today, the most similar locations to that are Northwestern's other generators in the EIM.
Okay. So the fact that the distance doesn't really make a difference as between how far the generator is from mid-C. It just has to do with the fact that the power is being delivered on Northwestern system at a point close to where the CBC projects will be delivering.
Yes, I think how our generators are currently, our current generators are situated is similar to how the CBC projects would be situated. That is each at their own location, but on Northwestern system. And so I think if you're going to look at EIM prices, the correct ones to look at would be similarly situated generators on Northwestern system.
Right. But the generator is delivering pursuant either to a contract or pursuant to Northwestern system requirements, right?
Which generator are we speaking of?
Any of the generators on Northwestern's bus bars in Montana.
Yes, I would say it varies, yes.
But it's like, usually they have a contract they have to satisfy, or there's a resource that has to deliver that Northwestern owns itself, correct?
Correct.
Is there a difference between that concept though and just the market price? Because market price could differ from contract price, right? We talk about that here all the time.
There is, but what Mr. Schiffman was trying to do here, I think, is to estimate the difference between mid-C prices and the value of generation in Montana. And so he looked at EIM prices. I think he looked at the wrong ones. And if you look at the correct ones, you get a pretty good idea of what the difference between the price is at mid-C and the price for generation in Montana in EIM. And
No,
it happens to be pretty consistent with what Northwestern's assumptions are about that basis differential in this docket.
Right, but on those bus bar points in Montana, do you know if each of these are under contract requirements?
Are you talking about every generator in Montana?
Well, every generator at a bus bar point that you're referring to.
So every generator within Northwestern's BA, subject to at least some size threshold.
Sure, I'm not
Has its
trying
own-
to expect
has
you to
its-
have perfect knowledge. Sorry.
Each of those gets its own locational marginal price. It has its own price node. And I reviewed a handful of those, including other QFs, and found them to have prices that are significantly lower than the prices that Mr. Schiffman selected.
But is that at that LMP node? I guess what I'm trying to get at, is that a market price signal? Or is that just the price that's being delivered pursuant to a contract or other requirements?
It's a market price. It's the value of energy at that time, at that location.
I think I understand what you're saying, but I'm trying to understand because it seems to me like if you're talking about a QF generator has a contract, right?
Correct.
Right. And if that contract was entered into, say, 10 years ago, the price could be very different than what the current market is, right?
Sure, but what Mr. Schiffman was testifying about is the difference between the price at mid-C and the price in Montana, and that's what I'm responding to here. Not
Right.
about what the contract price was of those resources, but what the value of that energy is in Montana compared to at mid-C.
Right. But let's just suppose hypothetically, bear with me for a second. This may take a minute. Let's suppose you had a utility that systematically undervalued third-party generation. And then LMPs were created for each of those. And you went around and looked at all those prices and said, well, look, this is well below what the other expert says is a market price. Wouldn't you be responsible for essentially lowering that price? If that, not you, that utility be responsible for lowering the market price as you define it because they have contracts with that utility.
Objection, compound and confusing.
Well, I agree with that, but I think the point is made. My point is, if you have a contract with Northwestern, they entered into a contract 10 years ago, and that rate is $32 a megawatt hour, right? Are you with me so far?
I'm with you.
Would that be the LMP price?
No, it would not.
Okay, what would go into the LMP price?
The LMP price would be calculated based on the generator offers in the market and the value of energy at that location at that time, regardless of what the contract price was. And in the context that Mr. Schiffman used it, and what I'm talking about is how that price compares with the value of energy at mid-C and how that informs the basis assumption on our forward-looking valuation of projects like the CBC projects.
But I think you would agree with me that there are some of these LMPs that are more liquid than others, right? There's more interest in that LMP in some places as opposed to others.
Mr. Uda, I don't think I'd agree with that, really. It's not a question of liquidity at that particular point. It's the market calculates a value for every location in every interval. And it's not that there have to be a lot of transactions there at that location. Liquidity isn't really relevant.
But if on a utility system, prices there have been systematically understated for whatever reason, could that affect the LMP price?
I'm not sure what you mean by systematically understated. The prices have been systematically understated.
Okay, I'm asking you to assume for the sake of argument, have a system, prices there are lower than they are in any other surrounding utility. There may be reasons for that, but would that affect the LMP price?
Are you talking about contract prices being lower, or what prices? I'm not following the question.
Well, what I'm saying is I assume, I mean, we're getting a little far afield here and I'm going to try to dial this back, but if you have demand in an area, there is a relationship between supply and demand, correct?
Generally, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are examples where that's not true. But if you have very low prices in a region, even though it is the case that those prices may be low for any variety of factors, correct?
Again, I'm not clear when you say prices are low. Are you talking about EIM prices, or are you talking about contract prices, or
I'm
what?
talking about, let's talk about EM prices.
Okay.
EIM. Okay. So prices vary by region, correct?
Yes. they
Okay.
do.
And what is the difference? Oh, excuse me, let me withdraw that. So they vary by region. So are prices generally lower in Montana or higher in Montana?
Then
California.
I don't know that I have an answer to that. I haven't looked specifically at California versus Montana.
about-
They're lower than mid-C prices, I would say, for sure.
Right. Are they lower in Idaho?
I think it depends on the specific conditions in each of those locations.
I think you're probably grateful that I'm moving on. I want to talk about market forwards. Did you testify about market forwards in this docket, Mr. Steinmetz?
Yes, I did.
And did we ask you for the data associated with those market forwards, including the transaction data?
Could you point to what market forwards he's talking about?
4 versus 2 years. I believe Mr. Steinmetz is advocating 4 years. If you want me to, I can read from CBC 64.
I prefer if you point to his testimony before we get to it.
Well, I can just ask him, Mr. Steinmetz, did you testify that you used 4 years of the forward curves instead of 2?
I don't see it.
Is that a question I should direct to Dr. Mock?
Mr. Uda, I'm looking at my testimony, and I did talk about Northwestern's use of 4 years of futures prices in our forward curves.
This question is directed to Dr. Mock, should be directed to Dr. Mock. Please let me know. CBC 64 says, please provide the forward natural gas and forward electricity price curves used as an input to power sim modeling in your analysis, including the raw input used to develop those curves, such as the IC mid-forward curves. Sorry, reading too fast. Understand, will slow down. Please provide the forward natural gas, forward electricity price curves used as input to the power sim modeling in your analysis, comma.
Into the mic, please, Mr. Uda.
Is it-
Commissioner Fielder can't hear you.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. Including the raw input used to develop those curves, such as ICE mid-C forward curves, trading volume, open interest, settlement price, et cetera, along with the derivation of those forward curves with all formulae intact. And your answer was see the CBC 064A file, not your answer, it was actually directed to Dr. Mock. The trading volumes and open interest positions were not used by Northwestern in the derivation of the forward curve. Northwestern is relying on the quote, fair use exemption of the federal copyright law to provide this file for purposes of this docket only. No copies should be made, nor should parties receiving this information use the copyrighted material for any purposes other than this document. This document has not been e-filed on the commission website. Are you familiar with that answer?
I am now, Mr. Uda. Yes.
Okay. So was the requested information that CBC sought pursuant to CBC 064A provided by Northwestern?
Mr. Uda, I'm not sure what was in the response that was referred to in the response to that question. I don't know if we provided that information or not.
Is Northwestern claiming in this docket that because it is now using 4 years as a matter of policy for its own planning purposes, that it doesn't believe it's appropriate to do anything other than use 4 years?
I might say it a little differently. I do think it's important to be consistent in QF avoided cost analysis with how we do our other planning activities. And we do use 4 years in our other planning activities. The reason it's important is because that ensures that the QF is getting similar treatment if we use the same process to develop forward curves for an RFP analysis or for the analysis of a resource Northwestern is looking to add. Then they're on equal footing. I don't think it makes sense to go back and forth and to use different forward curve assumptions or different methodologies in the two.
Well, who made that policy decision? Was that you?
It was not me individually, no. It
Well, do
was
you-
Northwestern. I would say that was probably made in discussions with the planning group and Mr. Lefebvre was probably involved in that as well. I
So
believe it was excuse me, sorry, Mr.
go ahead,
Lefebvre.
go ahead. No, please finish.
I believe we adopted that in our 2019 planning process and have used it since then.
Is when you file your plan, electric resource procurement plan, I believe it is. Is it a new name? It used to have another name. So when you file that plan, is that a contested case before the commission?
I don't believe so, no.
It's a notice docket, right?
I believe so.
Okay, and they're not like witnesses, there's not cross-examination. Is that right?
I believe that's the case. It's not really my area, the company that usually is handled in the planning group.
I understand that. So should I be directing these questions to Mr. Lefebvre?
I think he might be a better witness for those questions, yes.
I don't want you to get like out over your skis in any way. I mean, if you don't have authority to talk about it, I don't want to put you in an awkward spot.
Just want to preserve for the record that Mr. Lefebvre will not be prepared to testify on something that he did not testify to in this document.
Well, I think the witness just directed the question to him, so I think he should be prepared. He has plenty of notice. I mean, Mr. Chairman, somebody made the policy decision to move from 2 years to 4 years, and we didn't get any data that we asked for. And I need to have the witness who understands why these decisions were made before us so they can answer the question. And I think and I don't want to put words in Mr. Simons's mouth, but I think he's saying Mr. Lefebvre is a better witness.
Hill?
Mr. Lefebvre is the director of planning, so I guess we'll just deal with it when he gets on the stand.
Now you just took away all my questions. Let's see. Oh, Mr. Steinmetz, did want to ask you.
Closer to the microphone,
Oh,
please. Mr.
sorry. Mr. Steinmetz, I did want to ask you about ancillary services. Are you the right witness to direct that to?
To the extent that it's in my testimony, yes.
So what is the rationale for Northwestern's proposal that CBC pay both the variable charge and Schedule 11?
Can you clarify what you mean by the variable charge?
Well, what Mr. Grant was testifying to is that they have to deliver on a firm schedule, and if it turns out they vary from that by a certain bandwidth, they have to pay a penalty. Is that correct?
Is that a PPA term? I'm not sure where that's coming from.
Well, under Mr. Grant's proposal, he's planning on delivering firm power to Northwestern, and I presume that you guys have a schedule that is delivered by, and that there are certain consequences if you don't deliver the scheduled amount of power. Is that correct?
So I'll back up one step from there. The ancillary services that I testify should apply to these projects are schedules 3, 5, 6, and 11. Those are the ancillary services that would apply if these projects were not QFs and were in fact a third-party generator selling to any other customer on our system. On our system. I'm not clear what you mean by the variable charge and where that's coming from. That's not in my testimony. Can you
No,
the background of what that charge is you're talking about?
Well, my understanding is the way that Mr. Grant was proposing to deliver his power is he was going to firm it and deliver it during the high load hours, and that he would have to do that pursuant to a tariff that Northwestern has for delivery of firm power to Northwestern's system. And if he missed that schedule, he would get a penalty. Do you know whether that's true?
He may be referring to a PPA term. That's not one of the ancillary services that I'm proposing here in my testimony.
And just to clarify, I'm assuming that the ancillary services charges only apply to CBC 1 and 4 until CBC 1 and 4 can demonstrate they can self-provide ancillary services. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what I'm proposing in my testimony, that these charges would apply unless and until CBC can demonstrate that they can self-provide those ancillary services.
Okay, and under the FERC tariff, it's only wind projects that have to pay Schedule 11 as VERs, correct?
It's correct that the Schedule 11 applies to wind generation. We don't have a distinction in our tariff for hybrid projects at this time. And so that Schedule 11 would apply to the wind portion of a hybrid project in the absence of a specific category for hybrids.
But is the generator profile more similar to a wind project, or is it more similar to another kind of project?
I think it depends on the time and how the storage is being used and how it's being dispatched. If CBC has dispatch control, it's not clear how the output would be firmed or regulated or otherwise levelized, for lack of a better term. And so I don't think that there is any way to come to the conclusion that the output would look like more like a thermal resource, given that there could be many times that the operator chose not to store in the battery or discharge from the battery and instead just to deliver to the grid whatever was being generated by the wind. If Northwestern doesn't have dispatch authority, we don't really have any way of knowing that the profile would look any different than a wind generator.
Okay. But if what I'm, if as I've represented to you and you were here for Mr. Grant's testimony, I presume.
I was.
Okay. The plan is to firm the wind and sell it when it's most economically advantageous, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by the plan.
Well, the plan for this facility is that the purpose of the battery is to firm the wind and deliver it during the high load hours, right?
Are you asking if that's,
Can you point to some testimony from Mr. Grant or something to help?
I think he testified to it this morning. I mean, I think that's the plan. I don't think there's a dispute over that.
if by the plan you mean Mr. Grant's plan,
Correct.
I believe he testified to that today. I'm not sure where to see documentation of that, but I do think he talked about that.
And so if he does, is it true that if he doesn't deliver according to the schedule, he gets a penalty?
That sounds like a PPA term, and I don't know if you're suggesting that that's in the PPA proposed by CBC or in the PPA proposed by Northwestern, or neither. I'm not the witness to talk about that.
Mr. Chairman, it might help when the word schedule is used in the OAT tariff. It's called a schedule, and then there's schedules of time. So maybe that's where some confusion is happening.
But I would assume that any generator that commits to delivering power in a certain hour either has to deliver it or pay a penalty. Am I wrong about that?
There are a few places where you might incur what you refer to as a penalty. Imbalance charges are one place you see that. That's the difference between scheduled energy and actual energy. In this case, since Northwestern Energy Supply would be the transmission customer, Northwestern Energy Supply and therefore Northwestern's customers would be the ones on the hook for any imbalance charges.
So the generator wouldn't have to reimburse Northwestern for that deviation.
And I'm not talking about whether if that's a PPA term, that's a different matter. What I'm talking about is the imbalance service under the tariff.
All right. I think that's all the questions I have for you, Simon. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Uda. Mr. Brown.
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. We'll go to commission questions and start with President Brown.
Steinmetz, thank you for being here today. Welcome. A few questions for you. Can you identify any resources, any current resources dispatched to serve retail load for which dispatch is not currently controlled by Northwestern?
Yes, we have QFs in the portfolio that are renewable only with no storage, so they're not dispatchable. They generate when they generate. And we also have some older thermal QFs that dispatch control resides with the operators of those plants. And so we take the energy as it's generated from those plants.
And the ability to control dispatch of resources. What relevance does that have to Northwestern's obligation to meet federal NERC balancing requirements? If any.
I think it could have an effect on that, and that is where the question of ancillary services comes in. If we have the ability to dispatch the battery, it helps us stay within the NERC guidelines. If the facility owner is dispatching, as I said earlier, we don't know if that resource is going to behave just like a wind resource, at least some of the time, or if it's going to behave differently.
Okay. You would agree with me that your testimony describes Northwestern's concerns about choices CBC might make as to when to charge and discharge the batteries, which may or may not be in the best interest of the customer, correct?
Correct.
Under Northwestern's proposal, is there the potential for Northwestern to make decisions regarding when to discharge and discharge the batteries that would cause harm to CBC in your belief?
I don't think so. And here's why I say that. I think we would have established the operating parameters within which we could dispatch the batteries. I think that would be an important part of either the PPA negotiation or operating procedures, so that we could make sure that any dispatch instructions coming from Northwestern wasn't going to physically harm the facilities. And that's pretty standard. We do that with other generators that we are going to dispatch that way. I think the other place where that comes in is the economics. And that's where it becomes important to tie the expected dispatch with how the value was modeled in the avoided cost modeling. Because what you need is the actual dispatch to reflect the assumptions that were made in the modeling. And the assumptions made in the modeling were that the battery would get dispatched to its greatest economic value. In other words, when market prices are higher, we would be trying to put megawatts onto the grid or to serve load with those megawatts and avoid purchasing from other parties. When prices were low, we would be trying to store as much as we can in the battery for later use. If CBC has the dispatch authority, they wouldn't necessarily be following that pattern. And that pattern might not be what maximizes their calculation under their capacity contribution methodology if the commission were to accept the SPP methodology, for example. So I think it's important to align those things, and that way you ensure that you're not harming either party.
All right, thank you. There was some discussion about the mid-C and pricing. Is it the case that carbon emissions programs in place outside Montana affect electricity prices at mid-C and in Montana?
I don't know that those programs are currently affecting the prices at Mid-C in Montana. I think it's possible that they are. I don't know how to quantify that or what the impact might be currently. It's not something I've spent any time trying to quantify.
Very good. That's a fair answer. Would you respond to CBC's claim that Northwestern's reported non-firm sales provide evidence to support its transmission service basis differentials, representing only a fraction of its wholesale market sales volume
So I think it is true that our non-firm sales only represent a portion of our overall sales. As I think Ms. Hill asked Mr. Schiffman about this morning, during the period that he looked at, we had some significant positions at mid-C under our previous mid-C hedging program. So a lot of those volumes would have been not generated on our own system, but rather purchased at mid-C and then sold again at mid-C. So that would be one difference between the non-firm and the total volume. The other difference is that we would have some firm sales to other parties, which he did not include in that table. And we have sales where the purchaser buys the transmission, not Northwestern.
Do you respond to CBC's claim that Northwestern's transmission function books revenues that offset the energy supply's function costs, such that transmission costs are a zero-sum transaction for customers?
So I don't think that's correct. It's definitely not zero sum. That, as you alluded to, when Northwestern Energy Supply purchases point-to-point transmission on Northwestern system, the costs of that transmission service are passed to customers through the PCAM. On the transmission side of the house, those revenues are accounted for, and and my understanding of this is at a fairly high level, but those revenues are accounted for in setting future rates under our formula rate, under our OAT. But that's the rate that applies to all customers, not just Northwestern Supply. So it's nowhere near a one-for-one. Customers pay the expense and they get that full credit in lower rates. It's much more dispersed. Excuse me, more dispersed than that.
Very good. No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
You, President Brown. Commissioner Fielder, any questions for Mr. Steinmetz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a couple. Mr. Steinmetz, I'd like you to explain a little bit further on this topic that was just raised regarding concerns over CBC's choice regarding when to charge and discharge the batteries. And I believe your comment stated that that could be detrimental to the facility and to the customers. Could you please explain that?
Commissioner Fielder, I didn't mean to imply that that it would be detrimental to CBC and customers. What I intended to convey there was that it's important to align the dispatch of the batteries with the assumptions that were used in setting the avoided cost rate. And that way you can ensure that the rate paid by customers is in line with how the facility is actually going to be dispatched.
Okay, and I was just taking notes as you were speaking, so I may have paraphrased it incorrectly, so forgive me for that. The next question is, from what I gather, if Northwestern has a dispatch authority, they would use the energy to keep from having to purchase outside power during high price peak demand. Is that correct?
Yes, that's what we would attempt to do, subject, of course, to the storage constraints of the battery and the ability to charge it from the wind generation.
Okay, I understand. And are you under the impression that then if CBC has dispatch authority, they would use the stored energy when they could sell it at the highest price or the highest cost?
I don't think they would be able to sell it at the highest cost. I think under any kind of fixed price contract, they would get the same price regardless of when they dispatched, but they wouldn't have an incentive to try to dispatch it when it had the most value to customers, because they'd be getting the same price regardless of whether that occurred at 3 o'clock in the morning when prices were low, or at 4 in the afternoon when prices were high.
Okay, so this goes more back to Mr. Uda's line of questioning to you. The question that he asked you, I didn't really pick up from Mr. Grant's testimony, but I believe Mr. Uda had asked you or told you that the plan is to firm the wind and sell it when it is most economically advantageous. But you're disagreeing with that notion?
I think that is what Mr. Uda conveyed. And I think that he was implying that it would be when it was most economically advantageous to Northwestern customers. I just don't see where there would be an ability to ensure that that would be the case if CBC has dispatch authority. I do think that they would have incentive to try to maximize their capacity payments but with their dispatch pattern, and under the measure and pay SPP methodology they proposed, I think that they might try to maximize that value, which wouldn't necessarily be aligned with what has value to customers or with what was assumed in setting the avoided cost to begin with.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner Fielder. Commissioner Pinochi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll see if I can get some people a little excited here. So, Mr. Uda, you and your client have been gone for a while. And since your client's been gone, some exciting things have happened in Montana. A few months ago, we didn't have enough electricity in the state, so we had to bring it in from out of state. And I can't regulate that cost. And I think we had to pay 10 times more than what we normally pay. So let's say, Mr. Uda, your client had his turbines up and running. Mr. Simak, would that have prevented us from having to buy electricity from out of state? Or helped?
Commissioner Pinochi, if this project was generating at the time that we were buying high-priced electricity elsewhere, we might have avoided some of those purchases, yes, to the extent that it was generating.
And the ratepayer may have saved like
Correct.
10 times as much. Okay. All right, so that's good to get out there. So let's say we didn't need the wind generation. We could put that on the transmission lines, say from Colstrip to Washington, and maybe sell it for double. Would Northwestern be able to profit from that?
No, Northwestern shareholders would not profit from that. That excess revenue would flow back to customers through the PCAM.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. No more questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Pinochi. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you. Following up on Commissioner Pinochi's question, when it gets to be 45 degrees below zero in Montana, as it did just recently 2 years ago, and the one place that climate crisis people and I agree is that it's going to happen again. And if the scenario that he just pointed out, at 45 degrees below zero, windmills are not performing anything, and the battery would be completely discharged. They would have nothing to contribute to the system at all. So there would be no value. So it wouldn't help in that situation because there's no power available except for just a short period of time. But and I've been formulating this basically, throughout the Caithness witnesses, and actually for some time longer than that. If the battery is being used to firm the output of the windmills, then it's not available for discharge into the system at some other time. And then once it is used to discharge, depending upon how the wind is waxing and waning and all that stuff. Then the generation from the windmills has to go back into the battery to recharge them. So it's not available to come on the system. It doesn't appear to me, based on that situation, frankly, that batteries have much of a benefit at all. I'm just wondering, in it, the way that you see it, if the batteries are used to firm the system as it's generating to avoid penalties, whatever, what benefit do the batteries really have to Northwestern?
Commissioner O'Donnell, I think you've hit on a number of really important concerns. And Northwestern, throughout our testimony and our positions in this docket, have tried to address those very things that you're talking about. And I will start by saying I do think the battery can be valuable, and it is a question of who is making the decisions about when it's dispatched, either to charge it or discharge it, or maybe more accurately, what's the decision criteria to discharge and charge it. It does make the project more valuable than just a wind generator by itself, but that makes it a question of setting the correct avoided cost. And if you set the correct avoided cost, which we think we have proposed correctly in this docket, and your PPA reflects the appropriate terms and conditions and pricing and dispatch authority, then I think you can make as good an effort as possible to ensuring that the value that is actually provided by the facility is commensurate with what customers are paying for the facility. So I think all those things are important. You mentioned that when it's very cold, the wind typically does not blow very hard in Montana. That's a blessing, I guess, in every other context other than generation. But that's where the ELCC calculation comes into play, because it accounts for just that kind of thing. How much capacity can we count on from these facilities, when we have weather conditions that are extreme and when we really need it?
Thank you. One other thing, if Northwestern controls the discharge of the battery and wants to use it for market profitability, then if Northwestern uses it such, then it would not be available to Caithness for firming purposes. It's been used elsewhere. Wouldn't that be sort of subverting Caithness's ability to provide firm power to Northwestern? Potentially.
Yeah, and first I'll say market profitability in that context is benefit to customers, not profitability to Northwestern. But I think you're right. It is hard to see how the battery could be used for all the purposes that Caithness has said it could be used for all at the same time. So I do think at times it would make sense to be self-providing ancillary services. At other times, it might make more sense to be trying to store during certain hours of the day for use later in the day and providing ancillary services from Northwestern's fleet. I think it really depends on the situation. And we're talking about, a couple of decades that this project would be under contract. It's hard to foresee every detail of every situation and how we might best provide value to customers during that time. And that's why I think having Northwestern with dispatch authority would go a long way toward maximizing that value at any particular time to customers.
So just one clarification, that would be as if Caithness owned the battery, but Northwestern would be exercising complete control over the battery, which was one of the benefits of ownership. So they would own it they pay for it, but you control it. That doesn't seem to be fairly equitable to me.
Well, they would be receiving the avoided energy price and the avoided capacity price. And so they would be compensated through those payments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. Do we have any recross? Mr. Uda.
Mr. Steinmetz, I would note in your answers to Commissioner Brown, and I think just to, excuse me, President Brown and Commissioner O'Donnell, you mentioned that the benefit wouldn't go to shareholders, but it would all go exclusively to ratepayers. Is that correct?
Yes, I believe that's what I said.
And you're aware of the fact that Northwestern has a revenue requirement, right?
A revenue requirement related to,
But the company has a revenue requirement, right?
generally, yes, I'm aware of that.
And on your investments in plant, you're allowed to recover a reasonable rate of return, correct?
Correct.
So are you telling this commission that Northwestern never dividends shareholders?
Objection, outside the scope and combative.
No, what I'm asking is like, he's making this blanket claim that this only has to do with benefit to ratepayers. And that may not be true because the fact is there's one revenue requirement and they're allowed to earn up to a certain amount and they can dividend. I'm not wrong about that.
Mr. Chairman, he testified about the PCAM. He did not testify about the revenue requirement. The PCAM is a pass-through. It's entirely different than a revenue.
He just said the control of the battery, if Northwestern had it, would benefit solely ratepayers. And I'm saying that that's not always true. Because if you earn up to a certain amount, then you're able to dividend. Isn't that true, Mr. Steinmetz?
Mr. Ruda, I think Commissioner O'Donnell talked about dispatching the battery for profitability in the market. And I said that profitability in the market was benefit to customers. And I think that's exactly right. Our market purchases and sales are ultimately passed through to our customers, subject to sharing on a 90-10 basis that doesn't apply to QFs currently.
Right, but that
So
money.
I think
sorry.
that's what I was talking about. That is the benefit to customers. I didn't make a blanket statement about profitability related to our revenue requirement or anything else.
Okay, but the money from the PCAM goes into the revenue requirement, right?
Mr. Ruda, I'm not an accountant, but I don't believe that's correct. I believe the money from the PCAM that comes from market sales and market purchases is passed to customers in the PCAM.
So you've emphasized in these answers the benefit to ratepayers of Northwestern's ownership of the battery. Is that right?
That's right. I'm sorry, Mr. Ruda, did you say Northwestern's ownership of the battery?
Right. If you were not ownership, excuse me, control of the battery.
We both missed
I
that.
stand corrected. But that's not what PURPA requires, right? It requires ratepayer indifference, right?
Objection, that's a legal conclusion.
Ruda,
I'll withdraw the question.
thank you.
Now, in response to a question from President Brown, I believe he asked you, are you controlling the dispatch from other facilities? Is that right?
I believe you did, yeah.
Is that AGC?
Are you asking if we are controlling any facilities through AGC?
Well, no, I know you are, but I mean, your response to him was, I thought that you were saying that you control the dispatch from some facilities. And I was asking whether that was through AGC.
Yes, we have some facilities that we don't own that we have under contract that we control the dispatch through automated dispatch, yes.
Are any of the QFs in your portfolio dispatching pursuant to AGC?
I don't believe any of them are.
Are any of the current resources in your portfolio, do they have a battery?
No.
So it would be a correct statement to say that right now, you don't control any battery in Montana, right?
Correct.
And wanted to turn to another question. It has to do with how the transmission payments are accounted for. And you answered PSC 71A, correct?
I believe that's right. I believe I answered part A and another Northwestern employee answered part B.
That would be Mr. Durkin.
Correct.
And I believe you testified here today that you do not believe it's money that's balanced out as between generation and transmission functions at Northwestern, right?
I think what I said is it's not a 1-for-1 zero-sum game that expenses for transmission from Northwestern Supply come back to Northwestern Supply customers through transmission rates.
But it is offset at least somewhat, correct?
I believe that's correct to some degree.
And is there any evidence in the record as to what that amount is?
As to what the benefit in transmission rates is for expenses related to point-to-point transmission?
Yes.
I'm not aware of any.
I think just one more question, I hope, anyway. If Northwestern, oh, sorry. This is so confining. If Northwestern controls the battery, is it obligated to dispatch that battery such that CBC maximizes its capacity payment under the measure and pay approach?
No, I don't think it would be, and that's one of the issues that I think exists with that measure and pay approach. It puts CBC's interests at odds with customers' interests.
But Northwestern is significantly short on capacity. Is that correct?
I'm going to object just because that is in Mr. LaFave's testimony, and he can answer that.
Mr. Uda?
Well, my response to that is he's saying that the fact that CBC is trying to maximize the capacity puts it at odds with ratepayers. And I'm saying they're saying ratepayers need more capacity. So my point is they're doing what they can to drive down the capacity from the CBC project. In the meantime, telling you all they need more capacity, including a battery. I think it's a fair and relevant line of questioning for this witness.
Ms. Hill.
I don't have anything else to add.
President Brown.
Mr. Chairman, if I may suggest that if there is a witness who is available that has better knowledge of this, that it should be better directed to that witness, and Mr. Uda can reserve until that time.
Well, I would like, for the record, to say that I do feel like I should have had the chance to pursue this, because he's making and trying to plant a seed in this commission's mind that somehow the fact that CBC is trying to maximize its capability and its capacity payments is somehow at odds with customers' interest. And at the same time, they're telling you they need a battery. So, and they're short of capacity. So I understand the commission's ruling. I'm fine with that, but I just didn't want to let that go without making a statement for the record.
That is duly noted, and we will forward to Mr. Lefebvre responding to your question as well.
I'm sure he's looking forward to it.
If he, we can let Mr. Steinmetz answer. My objection was based on the scope of his knowledge. So I don't mean to stop him. We can let him try to answer, and then what he can't answer, he can kick to Mr. Lefebvre.
Mr. Steinmetz, answer to the best of your ability.
Sure. What I said was that CBC would be trying to maximize their capacity payment. And what that means is if they're using the SPP measure and pay methodology, I don't think that methodology aligns with actually providing the most capacity from the resource. I think it's managing to maximize that calculation, not managing to maximize the capacity benefit to customers.
I think I'm going to be satisfied with that answer for now, probably not forever. Chairman, I don't have any more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Uda. Mr. Brown, have you got any recross?
No recross, thank you.
Any redirect, Ms. Hill?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Steinmetz, Mr. Uda asked you some questions at the beginning of your testimony about a table in Mr. Schiffman's testimony. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
You talked about your analysis of that table, correct?
Correct.
Did you prepare a spreadsheet of that analysis?
Yes, I did.
Would that help explain some of the questions that Mr. Uda asked?
Yes, I think it would.
Mr. Chairman, may I provide that spreadsheet?
Mr. Uda?
Yeah.
I'm gonna object. He had every opportunity to put that spreadsheet in the record prior to this time. I haven't seen it before. My witness hasn't seen it before. And I feel like I've been fairly liberal with allowing documents in front of the witnesses, but this one, I'm concerned that we're not going to have the opportunity to be adequately prepared. And he's already gone through cross-examination. So I don't feel like it's fair to CBC to allow this at this time.
Ms. Hill?
I'll concede he hasn't seen it, and I'm not trying to pull a fast one. It's directly related to the questions. I thought it would help.
I think, Mr. Uda, your point is well taken, and let's forego that introduction.
I don't have any redirect.
Thank you, Ms. Hill, and Mr. Steinmetz, you are temporarily excused.
Thank you.
Thank you. And would propose to council that perhaps this is a logical time to end the proceeding for today, and that we would Reconvene at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning if that doesn't meet with any strenuous objections.
It doesn't, but I do have a procedural question about witnesses. Mr. Durkin is available for some follow-up questions on some questions that Mr. Uda had to Mr. Steinmetz. Does he need to be available tomorrow? If not, if we could have Mr. Durkin permanently excused.
Any objection to that, then fine, Mr. Durkin is permanently excused.
Thank you.
All right. Well, if there's nothing further, then at 3:55, we will adjourn for the day and reconvene at 9 tomorrow morning. Don't say Zoom.